want to be recorded, please leave and you will be able to watch the recording later. For folks that are on the call, if you're not from High Buds Club is a community of about 6,000 Canadian cannabis retail workers. We get on a platform, we have an app together, and we chat about all things about the plant that we love and the industry and anything new that's going on. It's actually like the funnest time, and I love being in there and chatting with everybody, which is also why I'm excited to chat with everyone today and for us all to chat with David. As always, I'm going to request that everybody stays on mute. If you'd like to ask a question, please drop it in the chat or use the Q&A feature. We will have time at the end of this session for lots of Q&A, which we will do by raising your hands, and I will re-explain that when we get there. But if you have questions during David's introduction, please just drop them in the chat or you can use the Q&A feature. But I'm really excited to be able to have David here so that he can answer such amazing questions we've been having coming through the platform, especially since there's been some drama this past week with the lack of updates to some of the regulations. So I'm excited to hear about that. Two other things that I will mention. We have our first members only smoke session next week where we're all going to get together and just like sit on a call together on camera and smoke and talk about what's new. So please join. That is on April 2nd. And then plop your name and email address into the chat and the store you work at so that we can select you so that you can win a future flight. And then the last thing is High Buds Club is a large and thriving community, but we always want new members so that we can continue to grow and bring in more new offerings for us all and build a robust community where we're all chatting and getting together online every day. So while you are watching, we would love if you would take a photo and share on your Instagram stories and tag David at Stratcann as well as High Buds Club. Spread the love, spread the vibes that we are here and providing education and all learning together, because I'm not going to say, I don't think all of my friends would want to join this. So it's like nice that we can find each other across the universe together. And yeah. Welcome to our regulation session with David from Stratcann. And David, take it away.
Okay, thanks Sabine, and thanks for everyone for coming in to this talk today. Thanks for High Buds for having me. My name is David Brown. I am the owner and founder of a cannabis company called Stratcann. We focus on the cannabis industry news and events, specifically here in Canada. We've been operating since 2020. While we cover all aspects of the industry, we do have a focus on more unique and often small-scale companies like micros and independent retailers. And we also have a really strong focus on regulations and policy. So before we get into the Q&A today, which I'm really excited about, Sabine has shared some of the questions in advance, and I'm hearing what you guys are interested to talk about. So I'm excited to get into that. But I wanted to give first a little bit of background about myself, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the federal and provincial regulations, as well as that report that came out last week on the Cannabis Act review. So first, as some background on myself, I've been writing in the cannabis industry for about 10 years now, since 2012. And I was one of the original founders of a company called Lyft back in 2014, where I was the editor-in-chief and communications director until 2018. Around that time, I took an opportunity to take on a position as a senior policy advisor with Health Canada's Cannabis Legalization and Regulation branch, which was still obviously working on kind of the final touches of the cannabis regulations, which came into force a little bit later that year. And I spent 2 years there with Health Canada in that advisory role, working first with the people actually working on the regulations, and then working with the stakeholder engagement team, where I had the opportunity to do a lot of outreach with provinces, municipalities, First Nations, as well as a lot of the sort of legacy cannabis community here in British Columbia, where I live. After sort of having my fill of government after about 2 years, I really wanted to get back into media. That's when I left in early 2020 and started Stratcann, and we've been going for about 5 years now. So as I mentioned, I wanted to talk a little bit, providing a foundation of the cannabis regulations and an understanding of where everything is informed from. The Cannabis Act, as I'm sure you all know, was the legislation that came into force in October 17th, 2018. And the Cannabis Act then informs the cannabis regulations. So the Cannabis Act is this legislation that is sort of the broad overview of cannabis, which is an amendment to several existing acts like the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, the Criminal Code, and deals with things like criminal penalties, prohibitions, obligations, licenses, and permits. It's also the Cannabis Act, which affirms the province's authority around things like distribution and cannabis sales within their jurisdictions. So the cannabis regulations then, which are informed by the Cannabis Act, deals with more specific day-to-day aspects of cannabis and the cannabis industry. So that's what allows for growing 4 plants at homes. That's what has established all the rules and different license types, like cannabis nurseries, cannabis micros, standard producers, labs, etc. And so it's the federal government that's licensing and regulating pretty much everyone that's handling the production of cannabis, as well as the entire medical cannabis supply chain. And then it's the provinces who are in charge of handling everything that makes its way into the non-medical consumer market. So the federal acts and regulations also establish various marketing regulations, and we see similar marketing restrictions and regulations at the provincial level through their own Cannabis Act and cannabis regulations. So, if you think at the top, you have the Cannabis Act, which is then forms the cannabis regulations. It also forms the opportunity for the provinces to establish their own cannabis acts and cannabis regulations, which generally deal with, not only distribution and sales, but marketing and promotion and how cannabis can be used, can cannabis be grown in each of those provinces, etc. And this is primarily why we see such a difference in approach in each province, as well as different products in each province, because the provinces end up being the gatekeeper. There's a few exceptions like Manitoba and Saskatchewan, but for the most part, the provincial buyers are the gatekeepers of what is going to come in and come out of the provinces, and that's really borne by the fact that that is how the federal regulations are established to provide that authority to provinces. One quick aside there is that that was something that the federal government is legally obliged to do. I've heard some people say they shouldn't have given the provinces that power. That's something that is sort of enshrined in the Canadian Constitution, and so it's something that absolutely provinces had to have. So, looking at breaking it down to the provincial level, I wanted to talk a little bit about those models. It sounds like most people here are from Ontario, but I wanted to talk about the approach that each province takes. So, going across the country, BC took a public and private approach, and so there's around 500 cannabis stores in BC right now. The majority of those are privately run. There's about 34 provincially run BC cannabis stores in the province, and the BC, while they have their distribution warehouse that they run, they also recently launched their direct delivery program that allows some small scale BC-based cannabis growers to bypass that system and deliver directly to cannabis retailers. Moving on to Alberta. Alberta is obviously an entirely private approach. It's been a bit of a Wild West there, and it's been holding steady around 750 stores for, I want to say, the better part of a year now. We see some sort of fall off and another fill in that space, and so that the ceiling there seems to be around that 750 mark. Saskatchewan and Manitoba are both fully private and are both sitting around 200 private retail stores. Ontario, obviously private, and is sitting around 1,800 that are currently authorized to open. The number of those that are open may be a little bit lower, but that's the number authorized, and that's been, while that number really ramped up in the first few years, it's really held steady for the last couple of years now. Quebec is one of the only provinces with entirely publicly run stores. They've got around 100 stores there. New Brunswick initially started off with only public stores. They have 25 of those. But starting last year, early last year, they began a process of licensing private stores, and there are now 7 provincially licensed private stores, as well as, I believe, 6 cannabis farm gate stores there, for a total of 37 retailers in New Brunswick. Nova Scotia operates entirely government stores, and there's 49. PEI are public stores, and there's 4. Newfoundland is private stores, and there's 52. The Northwest Territories have 6 private brick and mortar locations, as well as an online location. Nunavut has 1 private store, and Yukon started out as public, but quickly pivoted over to private, and there are now 6 private stores in Yukon. So again, when I often hear questions from growers as well as bud tenders in terms of, why can't I get this product in this market? Why am I unable to sell my product in this market? And again, it comes down to the fact that those provinces are sometimes maybe favoring products that are grown in their own province or have other criteria that they're putting in place to bring in product, as opposed to sort of every single person being able to sell into those provinces. One interesting thing to talk about there as well, pivoting a little bit to that report that just came out last week That report was an 18-month-long report from an expert panel that was tasked with looking at the Cannabis Act, and again, not the cannabis regulations, but the Cannabis Act. And one of the things they talked about there was encouraging provinces to allow producers not only to bypass those provincial distribution systems, but to bypass retailers and ship directly to consumers, which is, I think, is pretty interesting, and will put the ball in the province's court on that issue. But let's also then talk a little bit about that report that came out last week. And while I think some people have focused on some of the things that they are frustrated were not in there, I think it's first important to understand sort of the context of what that review was first looking at, and what it talked about within those recommendations. So primarily, the Cannabis Act review was a legislative review, not a regulatory review. And the goal when it was put into the regulations, when the regulations were passed, was honestly, it was pushed by a lot of the sort of prohibitionist, pro-clutching concern that we saw in the debate around legalization, where people were saying, if you allow cannabis to be sold, we're going to see huge spikes in youth use and huge spikes in use in general. We're going to see all kind of negative impacts in First Nations communities from this drug essentially being forced into their communities, and we're going to see all these problems with allowing people to grow cannabis at home. And the report was very clear that none of those fears have borne out. The data so far shows that youth use rates have not increased significantly. They've possibly increased a very small amount, depending on how you measure it, but there's been no spike. And in fact, looking at some provinces, there's even examples of youth use rates of cannabis going down since legalization, which I think is very interesting. It also looked at those impacts in First Nations communities. And while there are many First Nations communities calling for more access to economic opportunities, the concerns initially in the lead up to legalization really weren't about those economic opportunities so much as they were about concerns from community members that they were sort of being forced to accept cannabis into those communities. And what they heard in their review over the last 18 months was that a lot of those concerns were not borne out. And lastly, it concluded that there were no dangers with allowing Canadians to grow for cannabis plants at home on their own. All those fears did not really bear out either. So I think that's really important to hold on to that, because I think we forget just 5 years into legalization where the conversation was just a few years ago. And this allows us to say, look, this is what public health officials were saying. It didn't cause all these, the sky essentially did not fall. It didn't cause all these negative effects. And that's really important. Now, there were a ton more recommendations than just that. Without getting into too many of the details, I think most people here probably heard some aspect of the fact that it did not recommend increasing the 10 milligram limit for edibles. And I'm sure we can get into that quite a bit in the Q&A here. And I was, personally disappointed, but not surprised. I understand a lot of the public health arguments that go against raising that limit. And I think if people are curious to understand that, read the report, read the section on edibles. And while you may not agree with the reasoning, I think it's really important that people understand some of those public health concerns. They pointed, for example, to increases in hospitalizations, primarily from edibles, especially from young people. It did note that it's not, those numbers do not distinguish if those products are legal or illegal. But public health officials, that's the sort of thing that they point to and say, look, if we increase the limit on the legal side, we're only going to see more of these concerns. So I just wanted to sort of drop that in as a couple examples in terms of context of how to read that report that was released that week. But I know that's a whole lot of information to dump down, so I would really love to just sort of get into this Q&A and hear what kind of questions people have to say, based on all of that, or if there's any other information. I know one other thing just came out last week was the issue around so-called edible extracts. Organigram released something late Friday night saying they had received yet another letter from Health Canada reaffirming that Health Canada again is saying, no, those are edibles, those are not extracts. Stop selling them like extracts. And I think we're yet to see the repercussions. Are other companies likely receiving these letters too? I know there's a lot of these products on the market right now that are selling edibles for well over 10 milligrams THC. Health Canada has been very consistent for years now that they don't agree with that interpretation. And I think some people think that there's been some sort of loophole that's been achieved or something, and it's really just some companies getting ahead of the regulator in terms of what's on the market. and frankly, the federal government is really, really slow to respond to a product that they deem as not being compliant. So that's why we've continued to see this back and forth on those products. Okay, so all of that said, let's go ahead and get into the Q&A.
Thanks, David. Really quickly, just quick housekeeping before we dive in, because we have a good chunk of people on the call, we're not going to be using the raise hand feature. What I will ask is that everyone uses the Q&A feature or drops their question into the chat, and I will call on you individually to answer your question. I'll say your question for you, so please pop it in the chat, and then after David replies, you're more than welcome to come on camera and we can have a discussion about it. Keeping in mind time, though, I will be measuring our time so that we don't get stuck talking for 4 hours together, because I feel like that could happen. So if this goes really well and like we're vibing and flowing, we'll go a little bit longer. But if we're vibing and flowing and this is something we want more of, I'm so happy that David will probably come back and do the same thing again for us in a couple of weeks. And some of these resources that David was just mentioning, we did post on the network yesterday. So you can read David's, the Stratcann kind of synopsis of those updates, as well as linking directly to those updates and the suggestions into the act, right, David? And then there's also going to be a quick wrap-up email sent to everybody after this call with this link so that you can watch the video and get all of the resources as well. So with that being said, we've already had a few comments in the chat. And David, our first question comes from April. I think this is a really great question because you talked a little bit about youth rates. How did they measure youth rates? How does the measurement work?
Great question. So in the lead up to legalization, one of the things that the sort of public health folks in Health Canada that were looking at these regulations heard from people in places like Colorado and Washington was, we wish we had better data before legalization so that we could really accurately measure these things. And so Stats Canada and other federal agencies started tracking this primarily through polling. And so that's, when we talk about any kind of these numbers in terms of adoption of the legal market, 70% number gets thrown around that, 70% of purchases are coming from the legal market. This is based almost entirely on this polling that the government does on an annual basis. So obviously it needs to be taken with a grain of salt. One thing that I think to take into account there, though, is as we move into a more normalized landscape, it likely is making people more comfortable admitting to use in these types of polls. These are anonymous polls, but nonetheless, people might not be comfortable. And so, one would almost expect to see a significant increase through that normalization. And yet we haven't really seen those increases. So sorry, that was a bit long-winded, but yeah, it's based on polling that Stats Canada and other agencies are doing, where they're reaching out to people. They have a whole extensive, list of things they're asking, and one of them has to do with cannabis consumption. If they answer in the affirmative, then they're asking them questions about their use rates, how often, the sources of where they're getting it, etc.
Amazing, thank you. What a thorough understanding of Stats Canada. I'm sure you have a lot of other hot gossip in your brain. There was a couple questions that have been coming through the chat. So again, buds, if you've got questions, drop them in. We also have the questions from what people asked last week and a couple weeks ago that I've collected. But the next question comes from Sierra, and you had mentioned the updates with jolts and organogram and THC limits and edibles. What do you really think is going on there? We've had this conversation come up a few times in the network, especially since, of course, there's a lot of different products that could have more THC than 10 milligrams. So what does that really look like, and what do you think is happening?
I think you have examples of companies sort of on one hand chasing innovation, right? They see one company doing it, so they want to do it as well. We could sort of go back to the beginning. The first product like that was released was the Edison Jolts. They were on the market for a handful of months until a few other companies sort of saw it and thought, okay, well, we're going to try to do that too. That sort of caused that flood of, I want to say, early last year, was it, that we saw, into mid last year, before Health Canada finally gave some pushback and said, hold on, you're selling products that are not compliant. So, the background there is you have companies arguing that these products are extracts and are therefore not subject to the 10 milligram limit. Extracts have a 1,000 milligram limit. Health Canada pushes back and says, no, they're food by all definitions of the act and the regulations that we have here. You are using a sweetener. You have flavoring, and it's meant to put in your mouth. The companies, are pushing back on that and arguing that the sweetener that they use is not technically a sweetener. Health Canada has, been very consistent. No, you're wrong. No, you're wrong. But the process has to take a long time to draw out because Health Canada was sort of behind the 8 ball in terms of catching those products before they go to the market. And I think that's a piece of it a lot of people don't fully understand. So when you're a licensed producer and you want to submit a new product onto the market, you have to submit an NNCP, which is basically you send all of your information to Health Canada and say, this is a new product we're releasing onto the market, a new vape pen or a new, eighth or a new pre-roll or whatever. Health Canada has 60 days to respond to that. If in 60 days the producer doesn't hear back, they can release the product. Health Canada is always very clear to say that doesn't mean you're approved. It just means you're not approved. And so that's why you'll see these products that hit shelves that are arguably not compliant. Health Canada, I think, just doesn't have the resources. Maybe doesn't have their head in the game. It took them a long time to notice these products are out there. Once they're out there, they can't just make them take them down, because that might give some unfair advantage to the companies who got them out earlier. So you have this graded process where they send out a lot of warnings. Then they say, okay, here's the deadline for when you can stop selling them. That's what we saw last year. The reason they came back onto the market was Organigram used a ruling from a judge. They had brought a complaint to a judge saying Health Canada, the decision-making process Health Canada made in regard to our Edison Jolts didn't follow the rules. And the judge somewhat agreed and said, yes, I want to hear more from Health Canada. Organigram sort of used that to say, oh, they agreed with us. And so they released them back on the market. That's why we saw them for another, the last 3 or 4 months. I wasn't surprised that Health Canada pushed back again. I think this is just an example of companies, trying to make the best advantage of all of those aspects, factors that I'm talking about there, where they know that this pushback product process is slow. I had clients reach out to me well over a year ago asking about those products, smaller businesses, and I told them to stay away because I knew that Health Canada would be pushing back from this. I think the big companies can take those risks. I really worry about the small companies who take a risk like that and then maybe get stuck with a warehouse full of product that they can't sell, or potential penalties or losing their license or something like that. So big picture, you have some large companies who have the legal teams who can push these issues, but at the end of the day, Health Canada didn't budge and maintained that if you put it in your mouth, it's a food.
That's so interesting, David. I think hearing that, I just heard so many amazing things. I've never had anyone actually effectively explain that it's like a food situation versus like a different type of consumption. So I think that's a really interesting kind of like piece to the puzzle. So I really appreciate you explaining that. And from what it sounds like a lot of this is kind of because there's a little bit of like a chicken and the egg situation between like innovation standards and wanting to put out new product and race to the market and how slow the industry moves. But I also think this is a really cool showcase of like, we're all living in history making moments. Like the precedents are currently being set. And so like it's kind of cool that as much as we're all frustrated by this thing, we're actually witnessing like it get built, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. This is a formative time, and the industry will look very different in 10 years. But the things that are happening now will inform what it looks like down the road. That's and awesome. One of the great things, I say all of that, and I'm not shocked by Health Canada's determination, but I thought the products were great. I liked seeing them out there from a data standpoint. I think it was really interesting that they were out on the market long enough that we could track how popular those are. And that's a data point for industry to take back to the regulator and say, look, there is a demand. Obviously, we need to meet the demand with a regulated product. So, there's some great things. I think another interesting little facet that I watched, not all provinces release their sales data. British Columbia lately has been really good with releasing their quarterly sales data. Stratcann always covers it. And there's some interesting little trends you'll see in there. And one of the things I noticed was when all those products got taken off the shelf, the next 3 or 4 months, saw a noticeable increase in oils and capsules. And I reached out immediately and talked to several retailers, and every single one told me, oh yeah, absolutely. We have people coming in asking for jolts or, glitches or whatever these other products were. We tell them, I'm sorry, they're gone now. But did you know we've got, these raindrops or these, glacial gold capsules. And they sort of, I think there's a lot of consumers who, and I think bud tenders are probably aware of this too. There's a lot of consumers who don't realize those are in effect edibles. And you can get around that same 10 milligram limit by buying, a bottle of oil or a bottle of capsules. So I think that's another aspect where it sort of it shifted things around for the better, even if ultimately their products are not considered compliant. It brought that to the forefront.
That's really cool. I think we've had a few questions obviously keep coming in about THC limits. Do you foresee there being a change in the future for the 30-gram limit being increased?
Probably not. You say 30-gram limit for oil?
Jay Gas, this was your question. Do you mean for oil? Do you mean for like just general limit to leave the store with? Probably general limit to leave the store with.
Oh, gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great question. I don't see any reason why that couldn't be lifted. I just don't think it's been a big priority for industry to call for or anyone else. And so I don't think that issue has really gotten to the forefront. To me, that would be a bit of an easy win. The limit was put in place because of concerns from law enforcement who said, oh, we need to be able to distinguish, a drug trafficker from someone just driving around with their weed supply. There's obviously a good argument to be made that someone with 2 ounces, is that really, that's not a drug trafficker either. So I think there's good arguments. I haven't seen a lot of momentum behind those arguments, so I don't know that it's something that would get changed soon, but it's a much easier winnable argument, in my opinion. And it would, one of the questions that Sabine sent to me before, I would love to get into at some point, is some questions about topicals and things like bath bombs and the equivalency there. And that's one of the challenges. You can only buy a handful of bath bombs, and then that's your 30-gram limit. So raising the limit would obviously address that, and then we can get into the weeds on that later of the interpretation of the equivalency limit and how that's affecting topicals.
That's actually a perfect segue. I think 2 things is like, it's really nice to hear that there could be an easy win. Susie tossed in the chat saying that med patients can carry 150 grams. And so like, it's frustrating that rec can't buy the same amount. And I think like shamelessly from someone who's done a lot of time in retail and has managed a lot of stores before, I would love to be able to increase my amount of units per purchase. And you actually can only sell someone one product sometimes because of that limit. So I think that that's like very interesting. But let's talk about topicals and limits and equivalency and really what equivalency means. Because even when I try to explain it to like my friends, they don't understand.
Right. So the equivalency is, ties into that 30-gram limit. So you could have 30 grams of cannabis on you at a time, and therefore that creates a de facto purchasing limit as well, because the store can't allow you to break the law in that way. The federal regulations break it down in terms of an equivalency to those 30 grams. So for example, 1 cannabis seed equals 1 gram. So you could buy or possess in public 30 cannabis seeds at a time. For topicals, they get sort of tied into an issue where there's potentially a different interpretation. You have a 15-to-1 and a 70-to-1 equivalency for solids containing cannabis and non-solids containing cannabis. So most, here I want to look at the numbers right here in the regulations, make sure I'm getting this correct. Yeah, so non-solids containing cannabis, other than cannabis beverages, is a 70-to-1 ratio. And so if you are a topical and you are defining yourself in that way as 70-to-1, that's obviously brings up that equivalency a lot higher, right? And so that's why if you're buying certain bath bombs, you're going to only be able to sell them a handful at a time. Whereas I've seen some other products on the market that are arguably solids, but they are using that 15-to-1 ratio. And so that's why potentially, you're seeing different topicals that are maybe have that different equivalency limit. But basically, it's a way for Health Canada to provide an equivalency for that 30-gram limit for those other products. So it's dried cannabis is 1 gram, fresh cannabis is 5 grams, solid containing cannabis is 15, non-solid is 70. Cannabis concentrates are 1/4 of a gram, and cannabis beverages are 570 grams to 1 gram. An interesting note there is a couple of years ago, people may recall the rules changed for cannabis beverages. I wish I could remember what the gram amount was previously, but it meant that you could only buy a handful of beverages at a time. The industry, and frankly, it was Canopy, who lobbied very hard based on this, saying, look, we can't even buy a 6-pack. That's ridiculous. So they got that raised. And so maybe there's an opportunity there in terms of some of those topical products for them to make that argument too. the question there is, do those smaller companies making those topicals have the same kind of lobbying sway as the big companies like Canopy that are making those beverages? So I hope that answers the question.
That was actually so much good hot gossip. It's truly blowing my mind that I'm literally asking you these random questions and you just have the answer to them. So this is the best. I am enjoying this so much. Aliana asked a question that I think is actually super related. And then there's one from April that also I think is related. How does it work for stores that do delivery? Like, how are they getting over the 30-gram limit? Like, what's this loophole or this space in the regulations that allows the stores that do delivery to get through that? And then why does seeds have a dry weight equivalent?
Repeat the last one about seeds.
Why do seeds have a dry weight equivalent?
Gotcha. So the first question is, each province, when they establish, and I don't quote me on, I'm not sure. I know BC and Ontario have deliveries. I believe Alberta allows some deliveries now. But each province, when they establish those rules, then has a little carve out that allows the delivery agents to travel with more than 30 grams. In terms of if I think I understand the question about seeds is sort of why does it matter? It sounds like if there's an equivalency, the same reason, law enforcement essentially saying, look, we need to be able to distinguish someone between, someone who's a trafficker, even a seed trafficker, and someone who's just, traveling around with their seeds. And so, why they chose 1-to-1. There's some debate there, I suppose, but essentially seeds are a controlled product as well under the act, and so therefore they have to have that same equivalency. I think I answered your question. Let me know if I didn't.
I think you did also. Great. Is there another question that we got asked earlier that we want to throw into this, or is it too early for taxes?
Taxes?
Yeah,
happy to talk about them.
So we had two questions come in from Buds on the network. Is the CRA really going to have provincial wholesalers garnish their payments? And can you just talk about taxes? I think we also need to just explain what excise tax is and why it's a thing and a conversation, but how does it impact the products on the store level? That would be great, I think, to start with.
Yeah, absolutely. So, let's sort of go to the background of taxes. So previous to legalization, I want to say it was 2017, the government was having negotiations with the provinces. The government was looking at the issue in terms of establishing a federal excise tax so that there wouldn't then be a cascading effect where you had provinces adding their own taxes. And so the federal government brought the provinces into the conversation and said, look, let's have just one tax. Initially, the federal government wanted to split that 50-50 with the provinces. The provinces were like, hell no, we want more. Long story short, they agreed on a 75-25 split with the provinces getting 75% of whatever's basically sold, with their province's excise tax, whereas the federal government then keeps 25% of that. The rate, and this is the big flaw, the rate was established based on a $1, essentially $1 per gram, based on a, frankly, really bad information that those in the CRA and Health Canada and other departments were developing those regulations, and was often coming from industry. Deloitte put out a big report projecting these prices being much higher than they were, and so the idea was $1 a gram, with this idea that somehow $10 a gram would be a wholesale price, because that's where the tax is applied, not the retail price. That's obviously crazy and a huge error that the government made, that they didn't have anyone telling them there's not a chance that the wholesale price is not going to be $10. Sorry, I got distracted by the person coming in. And so, that's why it's then created this huge issue. So you have the federal government established this rate as a way to keep taxes lower, but it was based on an inaccurate reading of the market, believing that cannabis prices would be a lot higher. A much smarter rate would be that ad valorem 10%, which essentially they thought they were doing anyway. Right now, when that tax is applied for a producer, it's applied at the point before it's going into a provincial market. So that's essentially the price that they are selling it to the province at. So if I'm let's break it down from a grower standpoint. If I'm a small grower, I'm getting maybe $1 or $2 a gram for my product. I'm then most likely selling it to a processor who has the connections with the provinces. The processor takes a couple more bucks for that, and they sell and do everything that they do, and they sell it to the province. The excise stamp is applied at that point and at that sale. And so obviously when it gets into the provincial market, there's a few more dollars added both by the provincial distributor as well as the retailer. So if you're paying $10 a gram for the product, the tax was likely applied somewhere around, let's say, $6. These are very broad numbers, but that gives you a sense of sort of how off those figures are and why it's such a big concern from industry, because you have a lot of producers who end up paying 20, 30, maybe 40% of what they're bringing in from their sale to the provinces is then going to the federal government. So hopefully that provides, in a nutshell, why that was established, why it's such a big error. One other facet that I think people miss is that going back to that federal-provincial agreement, the federal government can't just unilaterally change that agreement now. So any changes to it would, there may be some tricks the federal government could take that I'm not aware of, but essentially the federal government couldn't change that agreement unless the provinces agreed to it. The provinces are not looking to give up that money. I think Ontario brought in $310 million from their federal excise taxes last year. They need that money. They want to spend that money on things. So getting them to give that up is, going to be a difficult process. So I'm not surprised that it hasn't changed yet. And I really don't think we're going to see anything in the 2024 budget that's coming out from the federal government in April. There's some speculation there'll be some changes there. I don't see it. What we could see and what has been rumored to change for a little while now is changes to the federal fees that are charged for license holders, and potentially the federal government could, take in less than their 25%, but they wouldn't really be able to change. From my reading, they wouldn't be able to change what the provinces are bringing in. So long term, I don't expect much excise change. I think the industry should be focusing on other aspects of that argument rather than just sort of making the demands. And making the demands sometimes in the wrong places. It's, Health Canada helped develop the policy, but it's a CRA policy. It's the Ministry of Finance. It's not something that Health Canada is going to change. And the Ministry of Finance and the CRA can't change it without dealing with the politics of all of those provinces and the hundreds of millions of dollars they're getting a year that they are not looking to give up.
Thank you. That was such a thorough explanation, and I think so helpful. We had Bethany put in the chat that she's having so many of her answers given to her that she's had for years. And so you had mentioned one thing is that you don't think that's necessarily what people should be focusing their time on. I would love to hear what you think they should be focusing on. That's as an alternative for us all, and that we can all think about it and activate towards it. But also I would love you to touch on just what recently happened with the CRA going to garnish those excise taxes.
Oh, right. Forgot about that one. So let's touch on the CRA one. I haven't seen the paperwork. Talked to a lot of people, though. It is absolutely happening. It's not a rumor or a thing that's going to happen in the future. CRA has reached out to the provinces. My understanding is it's really not that many that they're concerned about. There's a handful of larger producers who, are sort of teetering on bankruptcy or some form of corporate restructuring. A big chunk of their debt is CRA debt. Honestly, one of the things that producers, sometimes don't entirely tell the whole story on, they want to blame it all on the CRA. Oh, the CRA is why we went out of business. If you can, any of these companies, when they go through CCAA process, you can look at their books and you can see, the debts they owe. And I don't really think there's anyone going out of business just because they didn't pay their taxes. It's sort of part of a broader trend. And so you have the CRA seeing that trend, and they don't want these companies to make it more difficult for the government to get their money that, frankly, they haven't been paying sometimes for a couple years. And so this is the CRA taking action to sort of avoid, that process that some might take to avoid. And so, these are sometimes millions of dollars that they haven't paid in a couple years. So, it sucks that the tax rates are that high. At the same time, everyone knew that going in, and should probably have a business plan that entails paying your taxes. And then your second one, your other question, I think, was about what can industry do? I think, and this is a big picture issue. It's nothing that can change overnight. I think one of the missteps industry has taken so far is not better educating the general public, not just consumers, but the general public about these kinds of issues. The general public doesn't care about excise taxes. And I think a big part of that is because they see the industry still as the big shiny, guys in suits making lots of money, or they just don't care at all. And I think that's a failure of industry, frankly, to properly communicate those messages so they understand, the the grower is barely making any money. The processor is barely making any money. The provincial distributors are making a lot of money. Retailers are not making very much money. So I think that what each individual person can do is get educated on these issues, and then just talk to people, talk to your consumers, let them know what these real issues are. I think at the higher industry level, that's something I've been talking to a lot of folks for a while about now, is moving that conversation from just lobbying MPs, which has its place but is not the end all be all. MPs don't care unless they know that voters care. And you can go to Ottawa and take pictures, selfies with MPs, and you can bang on desks, but if they don't know the votes are there, they're not really going to do much other than pay lip service. So you have to convince the voters. Then you go back to the government and say, look, we've got the voters on our side. That's a high level answer. I know what that means for each individual bud tender, like I say, is think, when you can have those conversations with consumers and let them better understand how little everyone is making in this, and that if they really want to see this industry survive in a way that isn't just a bunch of big companies, that they need to talk to their politicians about this. It can't just be industry going to MLAs and MPs. It needs to be the general public.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate the suggestion also for actually what to do. I also firmly believe that voting is the best and we all should be voting. I have 3 questions. I've got one from Kaylee, I've got one from Emily, and one from Sarav, if I pronounced everyone's names correctly. But our question from Kaylee is more related to medical versus recreational. And I think this is really interesting with the group that's here right now to kind of have this conversation as well, because I know that a lot of people purchase from both sides of the market. So Kaylee's asking, why do you think it's important to keep medical and recreation so separate?
Well, I think I'm not sure I entirely understand the question, so
I'll give you the rest of it. If we integrate the 2 segments under one roof with educated dispensary technicians that can help with over-the-counter purchases, would that increase accessibility for both markets?
Okay, great. Yeah, great question. So one of the recommendations in that report that came out last week was to allow for pharmacy access, which I think, frankly, is kind of what you're talking about. The reason why bud tenders can't give medical advice is, they're bud tenders, that you're not allowed, legally not allowed to give medical advice. And so even medical advice about cannabis would be outside of that scope unless you're a trained medical professional. Currently, that's essentially only sort of doctors and nurses. There are a few examples of some pharmacies that have taken an approach that has allowed them to not only give advice, but to dispense cannabis. But they're sort of working some interesting angles of the regulations. So what the committee or the panel recommended is actually allowing that over-the-counter pharmacy access, as well as prescriptions potentially, or authorizing documents, I should say, not prescriptions. I think that would be an interesting approach. To answer your question, yes, I think that would increase access. I do think it would be challenging to have a situation where you have a pharmacist at a recreational store or any sort of other authorized medical professional. So I think you would probably have to split it up that way. That said, I mean, there's very smart people who could probably find a way to combine those things too. But the lack of over-counter access has been a criticism of the medical system in Canada for many years, from all sorts of angles. So it would be great to see people who need that guidance to be able to go to authorized medical professionals who can give them that advice, as well as providing them a wide array of products like we see at retail stores. Likely one of the reasons why we're sort of seeing the medical system participation of the medical system somewhat declining is because there is a chunk of those people who are previously using that who are at least in some way served by the non-medical market. But we also see a big chunk that continues to utilize that medical space. So, long answer to a simple question, which is yes, absolutely, more access is going to be good for medical patients.
I think that all cannabis questions cannot be short answers. It's just the industry is too new and too nuanced. I wanted to mention a side antidote, and then Emily's got a great question which relates to some of the questions that the bartenders were asking earlier. But there's one Farmer James store in Saskatoon, or it might be in Regina, I can't remember, that is beside a regular pharmacy. and the pharmacists at the regular pharmacy all got like cannabis certifications or something in like the background or whatever. And so they have like a handshake deal where if someone comes into the Farmer Jane, which is a recreational store, and is like, hey, like, can you suggest something? They'll be like, go next door and talk to the pharmacist. And the pharmacist will say, yeah, like maybe something with more CBD will help you. And then they'll come back over. And so I think it's an interesting workaround, but I think like a really cool and like magical moment because the stores like they worked together to do that, which I think is really, really awesome. So shout outs to Farmer Jane, either in Regina or Saskatoon, I can't remember.
There's also a pharmacy in Ottawa called Hybrid, with a PH, Hybrid Farm, and they are the one I'm referring to. That's a cannabis pharmacy, and so they have a medical sales license, and they basically have, I believe, the way it works is they have their secure storage kind of in the back. They have a medical portal where someone can come in at their counter and use a medical portal by interacting with a physician in some way, get their authorization, and then the regulations allow you to have your product delivered to your doctor, for example. And so that's on paper they have it delivered, even though it's already there. They go back in the back room and they bring it to you. So if anyone is in Ottawa and is looking for medical access, go talk to the folks at Hybrid Farm. They've been doing it for a long time. They're really, they really care about cannabis as medicine. It's a very cool approach, and I would love to see more examples like that around the country.
That's really cool. A question from Emily, and we had a few similar questions come through. What prizes are dispensaries, so specifically retail stores, able to offer up to customers? Are gift cards allowed? Like, how big can it be? Obviously, this is slightly different than like an LP inducement to a retail store, but is there an inducement from the retail store to the customer level?
Yeah, I wish I had a good answer on that. Every province is so very different. In terms of the gift cards, my understanding right now is I believe Ontario and BC both allow gift card giveaways. Each province does have a pretty simple kind of FAQ on all those kinds of things, and so I wish I was the encyclopedia that I am on some other things on each provincial marketing reg, but I really am not. But those have been loosening up, and a lot of the provinces seem, it's easier to change those kinds of rules and are often open to those conversations. I saw someone earlier asked about window frosting, and I think that's an example where industry in a few markets have successfully pushed against, now Alberta and BC have lifted those rules. Ontario hasn't, right? Ontario hasn't lifted that yet.
Someone mentioned this earlier. This came up, actually a few
Not
times.
yet. Okay, yeah.
I believe Ontario has, but it hasn't been enforced. So there's still the frostings up, or they've been talking about removing the frostings in Ontario.
Okay.
Yeah, but I know
anyway,
that's
so
provincial. That's
right.
A provincial thing.
And that's an example where industry has, I think, successfully pushed back. Alberta, shout out to Alberta with their whole red tape reduction. Industry has been doing a good job lobbying them to make a lot of changes. That they've recently allowed sampling. They've kind of loosened things up in some ways. So those are examples where I think retailers often are pushing back and talking to politicians, policymakers who realize, okay, we went a little overboard, or maybe it was necessary in the early days to be overly cautious, but now we could start to roll those things back. So giveaways and things like that. I know BC started to allow that recently. I'm pretty sure Ontario started to allow gift cards recently. Just check with your inspectors and check with those online resources.
So the funniest thing just happened in the chat, Saurav, who had a different question, works at the Farmer Jane that I was talking about, and it's in Regina. So thank you for that full circle.
That's awesome.
And I'm actually going to ask your question next. So that really worked out well for us. But I think this question, for some context, David, is like you might be able to help provide some context actually about like what the COA process is, specifically timelines for testing. Because Saurav is essentially saying and suggesting that like if you have old bud, potentially the THC could have deteriorated in that. Like, is a customer promised the right to the percentage on the label? What does that really look like?
Awesome question. And if you'll allow me, I can talk a lot about because this opens up the whole THC issue, which we haven't talked about yet. So great question about THC, and yes, THC degrades over time. There's Rob from Supra Labs. I'm spacing on his last name right now. I've written about him a lot on the website. He's done some of his own testing of products, and that's one of the things he talked about is not only THC degradation over time, but THC degradation in the process itself, and then being rattled around in a container, a lot of THC falls off. So yes, a consumer should be entitled to what the label on any packaging says. The approach with THC in Canada and in other markets as well, is very amateur. I think it's we obviously are not getting accurate results. One antidote obviously would be Health Canada more properly regulating those and doing more spot testing, holding labs accountable, holding producers accountable. There's a whole host of reasons why they haven't. Some of them valid, some of them just excuses. But on the other hand, consumers have a bit of power, and retailers, and I'm sure you guys can speak to this, that there's a conversation to be had that those, while consumers should be entitled to know that those are accurate, we should all know that they probably aren't very accurate. And there's a bigger conversation there too about does it really matter if it's 9% or 12% or 21% or 29%? THC is not just the only thing getting you high, or we'd all be smoking just disty pens all day long. So yes, it would be great if those labels were accurate. There's a whole lot of reasons why, unfortunately, they're not. Some may be gaming the process, and some of it may just be the things you're talking about, where it's degradation through age or through the manufacturing process, the trimming process, depending on when that product is tested. And I think that's sort of the heart of what you're talking about, is those tests should be showing exactly providing the most accurate representation of the product, and not sort of the best ideal circumstances. And that's the general approach industry, even pre-legalization, has always taken in terms of, at least, you choose the highest cola that you send over to the lab, or you maybe sprinkle a little key for whatever little tricks that the pre-legal market used to often do. I would imagine a lot of those practices have made their way into the legal side. And then on the lab side, labs can sort of fiddle with the results as well. But I think that implies a lot of maybe sort of nefarious activities, and there's a good argument to be made that a lot of this is just because it's very difficult to get accurate THC measurements. And speaking of, the fact that our products are labeled to the 0.00, so it's ridiculous. Is someone going to notice if it's 23.01% versus 23.5%? I mean, we have to get away from that and stop pretending like that really matters. I've had amazing weed that's like probably 15%, and I've had really boring weed that's probably 35%. Anyway, that was me getting on my high horse at the end there.
I don't think that was a high horse. I think that was like just a good sized horse that I believed in. We have a couple questions that I kind of think are related also. So this has been working out very well for us in terms of a story and a narrative. But we had a few questions come in earlier about like packaging and labeling, specifically about like, why are there no symbols for if a product is or isn't irradiated? Why are there no regulations for adding harvest dates? And then we're having now questions pop in about like, why don't edibles then have a best before date listed? And like, why doesn't flour have an expiry date listed? Because of course that all really factors in. If I'm buying flour that's 5 years old, which it probably wouldn't be at this point, but if I'm buying flour that's 2 years old, it might not be exactly the THC listed on the label anymore. So labels, dates, talk me through.
So I think the first one you asked about is why no irradiation label. My understanding is because the irradiation label only applies to food and not to cannabis. If that rule was changed, then it would be required to be on there. The majority of your products are remediated in some way, not necessarily irradiation. In fact, most companies now use e-beam remediation. There's a company here in BC that even a lot of producers on the other side of the country send their product here because it's a little more gentle. So it's not technically irradiation. And then there's another company here in BC that even has one that's even, I don't recall the name of the process, but is even sort of less invasive than the e-beam approach. But one of those approaches is likely be taken by the majority of the producers out there. So, but that's the reason why it's not labeled, is the federal regulations only apply to irradiated foods. The next one was about...
We've got, why are there no regulations for harvest dates?
Harvest dates, yeah, great question. I mean, those could be put in the federal regulations. At the same time, that's another layer of sort of regulatory burden. I would argue that a better approach would be convincing producers to start putting that on, or supporting the producers who do. We see a lot of producers very transparent in their labels, a full terpene, cannabinoid and terpene profile, harvest date, even packaging date. that's sort of a free market approach, I suppose. So I try to support those companies that do that, and direct other people to as well. But yeah, that it could be changed at the federal level if there was enough motivation to. I think industry would potentially push back. Just there's a lot of stuff they're required to put on there that maybe they don't want to. So
I know that the nuances to the marketing regulations are like actually insane. And like all of the specifics about labeling, I can't even conceptualize. So that is a conversation we can have on another day. And I want to give us a quick time check. So for everybody watching and listening, I'm going to give us another 10 minutes so that we can all go back to our lives. But please keep asking your questions in the chat. If there's anything we've missed, we'll try to direct them and get you those answers in the network. Of course, this will be available to rewatch. But I would also love for everybody to take this moment to take a picture and share it so that we can get more bud tenders in the network, and just talk about how this has been the best information of all time. I've literally been obsessed. Thank you so much, David. So then back to our questions at this time, though. We've got a couple of questions that are, again, related to timelines, THC. So why isn't there then expiration dates listed on products, flower or edibles? That now seems weird because now if an edible is a food, I'm like, is there a mismatch? Like, what's that mean?
Great question. And I wish I had done a little bit more homework on the edible one, because I do know the answer to that. I actually worked pretty closely on that file, but my brain doesn't remember things. So the best answer I can give there is the regulations were written in a way that specifically excluded cannabis edibles from some of those rules. My understanding is it had to do with the complexity of harmonizing the Cannabis Act and cannabis regulations with the existing food regulations. That was one of the things that I learned when I was really happy to learn when I came into the government. It's very humbling. So the complexity of all these things are so, you change one little thing in one set of regulations and it could affect a whole other set of regulations. And so when they were creating the Cannabis Act and the cannabis regulations, the process of interacting with all these agencies, including those who had food regulations, there was a lot of things that had to be taken into consideration. So sort of talking around it there, I could probably get into that better next time and do my homework and answer that question next time. But the easy answer is the regulations were written in a way that specifically prevented cannabis edibles from being adhered to those issues. In terms of expiration date on THC, there is no information on that. So it would be sort of impossible for the government to require industry to provide that. There's a good argument to be said, I think, that government should be doing that, or government should be requiring industry to do that. Absolutely. The Cannabis Act and the cannabis regulations were the first stage and will continue to be refined. And that's one of the many examples where things could be improved upon, and an example where industry should ideally be moving in that direction and encouraging that kind of research.
Amazing. So if someone wanted to do something to make some of these changes that we're seeing, really the best case scenario is to push for agency-driven like movements. That's really asking our LPs to make these changes so that it becomes like a norm in the industry.
I would say, lobby everyone possible. You could always raise these with the federal government, as well as even, the provincial government, who can filter it up to the federal government. Health Canada is often doing surveys and public feedback, and that would be the time to provide that answer. And I can say that all governments really do honestly want to hear quality feedback from industry, and everyone here as bud tenders or owners or other aspects of the industry, your voice is important. And when they have those kinds of public consultations, as well as just anytime you want to provide them with the feedback, take the time to give it in the context of kind of everything we've been talking about here. Taking into account their public health concerns, speaking it to them in their language. And so I think, that's an example where you could say, look, this is a way to, better protect public health and public safety, as if this information was provided, and, draw parallels to other similar products on the market that are subject to similar regulations. At the same time, there's an argument to be made to go to producers and say, why aren't you guys doing this? We would like to see you to do this. There's no reason that a third party certification agency couldn't do something. There's no reason that producers themselves couldn't sort of all agree upon certain terminology that they're going to use. Obviously not all producers would adopt it, but you could see sort of collectives of people that start to adhere to whatever agreed upon standard to grade the quality of the cannabis, or have marketing dates, or packaging dates, or harvest dates, or anything like that.
Oh, amazing. there's one question that I would love. It's more like a personal opinion question that came from the group. Since legalization, have you seen Health Canada actually drive for like awareness and cannabis education, like driven from Health Canada themselves?
Oh yeah, there's a lot of examples of education programs that they put out over the years, and all that's publicly available. And they do sort of annual reports where they talk about all aspects of cannabis, and so there's always sections where they talk about the publication education programs they've done. You know, I would be missing a lot of things, but you know, they do social media campaigns often targeted towards young people. They do public awareness campaigns and billboards and signs on buses and stuff like that. And I see ads on YouTube.
Oh, we lost David. He might have lost his camera. Well, happy chat, everybody. Let's see if we can get David back in a couple of minutes, but we have so many questions that came through. Did everybody like the session so far? If you want to come on camera, you can, and you can talk about it. Does everybody like the session so far? I've been hearing so many great things. I'm like having the best time.
I love this one. This one is so different than like any of the other ones we've had. Like the other ones have been very brand focused, which I do appreciate, but getting to like more of the like the law side of it, more like the higher up side, and just hearing like different forms of that, it just was really interesting to get a different perspective than what we usually get. Like I love this one.
Oh, thanks. Thank you so much, Bethany. That was like the best feedback. So the vibe is that we would like to do more of these.
Absolutely.
Amazing. Amazing. Yeah, I think we were really excited to be able to offer this as well because of exactly that. Like David's perspective is not working for somebody else, and he actually has helped influence a lot of the rules and regulations. Vanessa / Elise, can one of you message David, just make sure he's okay, just send him an email for me. But if not, that was actually our timing anyways. So yeah, just check on him, make sure he's okay, and just tell him that we will book him again in the future and that we love him so much. Amazing, great, go team, go. But what we'll do with the rest of these questions, because we obviously lost David halfway through, we'll upload the actual version of the video. He's back. David, you're back?
Hi, David.
David, can I see you?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're back.
Perfect. Okay, sorry about that.
That's okay.
I forgot to plug in my computer.
We were so engaged. We were like just like staring at your face, and then you were gone. But we have 5 minutes. I'm gonna give us 5 minutes. We've got a couple more questions, and then but while you were gone, I was asking everybody how they felt, and they said that this was like super informative and just like a very different perspective than they've ever been given. So everybody would love to have you back again. So I think we should love to book something for 4 weeks out. I think that would be awesome.
Awesome. I had a lot of fun. I hope my answers weren't too long-winded. I love to talk about this stuff.
No.
I would love to. I will do my homework on the edibles one, and we'll have. I can even give a broader little report on that. But this is something that in terms of industry stuff, I have really great connections on the producer side. I often don't have a lot of engagement, especially at the bud tender level, and so I'm looking forward to continuing these conversations and hearing what you guys are hearing on the front lines. I think it's an important part of the conversation. But yeah, I've got more time if you want to keep going.
Yeah, we have one question that I think will start some like more questions potentially, and I feel like will be a longer answer from you. It's really about data deals and the future of data deals. And I think like something that's interesting that I've learned while working in this industry is that data deals are common in every other industry in a lot of components. You often pay for shelf space in a grocery store. But obviously data deals are a problem. They're a gift and a curse in a lot of ways. What are your thoughts on the future of them?
Yeah, I don't think they're going anywhere. I don't think you can get rid of them. Like you say, they exist in every industry. They exist in alcohol, even though they're not supposed to. So, the reason why you see Doritos on the end of the aisle and not some off-brand is because of an arrangement. Yeah. And so it makes sense that cannabis is that way. I think the better approach for provinces would be to admit that it's going on and try to at least regulate it. The reason we call them data deals is because the approaches these companies take is they say, this person is not paying me for shelf space. They're paying me for, all this great data I'm giving them. So it's not going to go away. Yeah, it's not going to go away. So I would, sort of choose, where you use your limited energy in terms of fights. I think the best way to deal with it would, in terms of using that energy, would be talking to the government and telling them they need to properly regulate it. In the same way that, my understanding is that there are rules and regulations around alcohol for the government to, at least oversee that in some way as well. So I think that's the best approach. There's always going to be people paying a little extra for shelf space, and there's always ways to get around whatever rules are in place.
My selfish, shameless opinion is that I think a data deal is fine. But I also think that if like your retail chain is making data deals and is not paying the budtenders a fair wage, in a lot of ways, I'm like, where is this extra money going? And so I just think everybody should be paid fairly.
I mean, there's good argument. I understand why retailers do it. I understand why producers do it. There's a lot of people who do it even though they don't want to. It's just sort of the name of the game. So, yeah, sometimes this industry can sort of be, crabs in a pot, I think, and trying to pull each other down because someone else is perceived as getting another advantage. I get it. I understand if you're a struggling business, you're frustrated and you want to look around and say these guys aren't playing by the rules and people should play by the rules, but very similar to other consumer packaged good industries. So it's just kind of how it goes. As a retailer, I think, if you're frustrated by data deals, lean into the more independent products, the more unique products, and try to distinguish yourself that way. And hopefully there's an opportunity there. I'm not a retailer though, and I know there's a whole lot of challenges there that I'm not aware of.
I think that's a really good point is I think there's an opportunity for differentiation in terms of like what different stores offer in our market. And I think we'll see that as the industry continues to grow and that stores might potentially specialize in certain offerings. And we see that in the States. But I think that is a good point is like if you're finding it frustrating that everybody has the same things or that you can't offer the same prices because of what's been happening with those data deals, there might be other products that can fill that spot for you and that come from like a local producer or a smaller guy and you don't have to worry about it. And then you're offering a different offering to your customers that they can't get across the street.
Yep. And, BC's direct delivery, I think is the best example of that. And there, I could get all into the nuances of that and where it is and isn't working. And sometimes it's not working because retailers say they want to support it, but they're not, willing to put in the extra work to actually support it. But, Ontario, where the majority of people in this call are seem to be from, the flow through system is sort of built to mimic that as well. I know that there's a lot of problems with it, but it's evolving. And that's the OCS's goal is actually to potentially get to a place a couple of years down the road where they could have even a direct delivery model. And so I would encourage retailers to, work that flow through program as much as they can to identify unique products, go out and talk to producers who have unique products that you like and encourage them to go through that flow through process, because that is what it's built for, as a way to get more unique stuff that maybe not everyone's going to carry. And I, when everyone's carrying nearly the exact same thing, if you're a good retailer, you know how to sell, and you have a client base who is willing to be educated, it seems to me that there's a huge opportunity out there because there's some great product that a lot of people don't know about. Shout out to Organic Craft and Sweetgrass, for example.
Love them. I think we'll actually wrap it up really shortly, but I think that we could talk probably about OCS flow through, and I feel like we could talk about province selling specifics a million times, but correct me if I'm wrong, the OCS brought in flow through for that reason, to trial new offerings in market, and then will things move from flow through onto the regular or no?
Not necessarily, but I think there's an argument there, right? If you can then show the numbers, hey, this thing is moving, that's any provincial buyer's concern is, are we taking on product that's not going to move? They want to sell products that people want to buy. So if you can prove to them through the flow through program, or, this is speaking more to producers, but it's a good opportunity for producers to maybe, test a product on the market.
I think that's a good point too, because I think, actually, we can't talk too much more about flow through, but I think it's a good point, is because really that is, I think, the fundamental thing with our industry is each province is purchasing these products and each province is functioning like a store, and they're trying to collect things that they know they can sell to retailers. And so that makes a lot of sense, is like they don't want to, so for flow through products, if anyone doesn't know, flow through doesn't sit at the OCS warehouse. It comes from the producers when you make the order, essentially. So it allows the OCS warehouse not to have hundreds of thousands of items that are extra that they don't think are going to move. And I think that that's an interesting level to this, is like, right, they are just a retailer selling to the rest of us, trying to make sure that their product doesn't sit on the shelf.
Yeah. I saw, actually, I think this ties in. I just saw a question about, why can't, get rid of flow through. Why can't OCS just build a bigger warehouse and address those issues? I think that's a great question, and that it's a good question because it provides an opportunity to talk about the realities of something like the OCS, which is the largest cannabis warehouse on the planet, right? They have more weed than probably anyone, certainly in a legal regulated market. It's a lot of cannabis that comes in and goes out on a daily basis. And so, being able to bring in really small batches, it's a logistical nightmare. It's not necessarily about space. It's the extra logistics of every extra piece they bring in. It's no different than here in British Columbia. That's not to defend them. I know that, there's a lot of gripes about how the system works, but more to provide an opportunity to think about the complexities of the system they have to deal with. So I think it's great that they have a goal of moving towards building a system that will ideally better work to get those unique products onto the market. I also do hear from a lot of retailers that they're not quite hitting the mark yet. But I would say that that's not a reason to get rid of it. I would say that's a reason to work with them to improve that.
Amazing. Well, thank you, David. To wrap us up, everybody, the pinned comment has the Stratcann Instagram handle and the Stratcann website. Please use David as a resource for the industry. His reporting is some of the best that I've seen from anybody that reports on anything in the industry. And he's always available to answer questions. And as always, this will be available to rewatch later. David, do you have any final words for the crew?
Just thank you for having me. Thanks for everyone coming out and awesome questions. Thanks for making me do my homework on a couple of these questions. And I really look forward to coming back next time.
Yeah, I'm so excited to see everybody next time. And hopefully we see everyone on April 2nd for our first session where we're seshing together and talking about weed, which I'm really excited about. And I've been toying with the idea of making everyone wear like the fun face filters while we do it, but we'll decide that next week together. But happy Wednesday, everybody. And thank you for being here. Thank you again, David. And we'll chat with everybody soon.